by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's such it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what...
The words were barely halfway across the page when Camilla understood exactly what had happened. This was not a warning, a temporary restriction, or another palace dispute that could be softened behind closed doors. A sealed decree carrying the authority of the late Queen Mother had surfaced, and its instruction was brutally specific. Camilla was to be excluded from every formal crown event governed by its terms. In one devastating moment, her royal future changed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla slowly lowered the document onto the table and removed her glasses. Across from her, Charles remained completely still, while William watched the pages rather than the faces around him. Senior legal advisors had opened the sealed archival envelope only minutes earlier, during a restricted palace review, a private examination reserved for documents considered too sensitive for normal administrative handling. The decree itself was a formal written instruction carrying continuing ceremonial authority, and its language left almost no room for comforting interpretation. The Queen Consort read the decisive passage again. It barred her from qualifying crown ceremonies, formal state observances, and dynastic events specifically protected by the document. Crown ceremonies were occasions where members of the royal family formally represented the sovereign and the continuity of the monarchy, so exclusion carried far more weight than simply losing invitations. For Camilla, those appearances had become proof of something deeply personal. After years of public hostility and gradual acceptance, she believed she had finally secured a permanent place beside the king. Charles felt the conflict immediately. He wanted to protect his wife, yet the instruction came from the Queen Mother, a woman whose influence had shaped his understanding of duty from childhood. He looked toward the lawyers, searching for some technical escape. None came. One advisor carefully explained that the envelope had been deliberately sealed until a succession-related condition activated its review. William then leaned forward. Attached to the final page was a handwritten notation that had not appeared in the typed summary. The future king read it once, then again. Camilla saw his expression change. Whatever had been written there suggested the Queen Mother had expected resistance when the decree eventually surfaced. This had not been created casually. Someone had anticipated the argument now unfolding decades later. Camilla closed the file. Then she turned toward Charles. "Did you know about this?" The monarch did not answer immediately. That silence struck harder than any legal sentence on the page. Because the question was suddenly no longer whether the decree existed. It was why the Queen Mother had gone to such extraordinary lengths to create it, and whether someone inside the family had known this day was coming. And Charles's silence would become even more painful once Camilla realized that everyone in that room had something different to lose. Behind the language of decrees and ceremonial rules were three people standing on completely different emotional ground. Camilla saw years of acceptance suddenly being pulled away. Charles saw the woman beside him colliding with the wishes of someone who had shaped his earliest understanding of monarchy. And William faced something even more uncomfortable, an old royal instruction that appeared to protect the crown he would one day inherit, at the expense of his father's wife. Camilla carried the deepest personal wound. Those crown ceremonies had become more than formal appearances. They were public moments in which senior royals represented the sovereign and the continuity of the monarchy, and for her they had come to symbolize something even more important: acceptance. After years of scrutiny, rejection, and careful rebuilding, standing beside Charles at those events had shown that she was no longer treated as someone outside the royal structure. Charles understood that immediately, which made his position almost unbearable. The king had inherited a culture where written instructions from earlier generations were rarely dismissed casually, especially when they touched ceremonial continuity. Yet he was also a husband watching his wife feel as though decades of loyalty had suddenly been reduced to nothing more than a line in an old document. Camilla waited until they were alone before speaking again. No aides remained. No legal advisors stood nearby. She sat across from him and asked whether years of duty could truly be erased by the wishes of someone who was no longer alive to explain herself. Charles began carefully, saying the decree could not simply be treated as an insult or ignored because it was painful. She stopped him. "Look at me when you answer." The monarch lifted his eyes, but only after glancing toward the fireplace first. That hesitation hurt more than anger would have. Camilla saw it as proof that part of him was already considering obedience. William carried a different burden. He felt sympathy for his father, yet the future king could not escape the principle beneath the decree. If inherited royal boundaries could be abandoned whenever they became emotionally difficult, then what protection did any future rule truly have? He knew that question would someday belong to him as sovereign. Sophie then uncovered something even more troubling while reviewing the ceremonial schedule attached to the file. The trusted confidant realized the document did not only exclude Camilla, it named senior royals who were expected to assume specific duties after her removal. Her own name appeared. Sophie read the list again. Certain responsibilities involving remembrance, continuity, and dynastic representation repeatedly redirected toward her. The pattern was too deliberate to dismiss. The Queen Mother had apparently imagined not just Camilla's exclusion, but an entire replacement structure around it. William noticed the same pattern, and the implication disturbed him. This no longer felt like simple personal dislike. Someone had planned for a future confrontation, and as he studied the old instructions, one thought became impossible to ignore. Something specific must have happened to convince the Queen Mother that this boundary had to survive long after she was gone. To understand why that hesitation mattered, the family had to return to the moment when the Queen Mother apparently decided that one boundary could never be crossed. Long before the sealed decree returned to haunt the palace, there had been one private royal evening that changed everything. It was not a constitutional crisis or a televised confrontation. It was quieter than that, and therefore more dangerous. According to the narrative preserved around the document, the Queen Mother watched a single ceremonial disagreement unfold, listened to what was said afterward, and reached a conclusion she never publicly announced. Certain crown spaces required permanent protection. The tension had begun after a major royal remembrance service, when discussion turned toward a future family ceremony. Such ceremonies were not simply private gatherings. They were carefully controlled royal occasions where senior members represented dynastic continuity and the public face of the crown. The Queen Mother had always believed those appearances carried meaning beyond personal relationships, and in her final years, she had become increasingly wary of emotional pressure, changing who was allowed to occupy those spaces. Camilla pressed Charles privately after the planning meeting. She wanted him to reconsider her exclusion from the upcoming ceremony, arguing that keeping her outside would only preserve an old division the family was supposed to be moving beyond. He listened, but the conversation became sharper when she reminded him how much public criticism she had already endured for standing beside him. The Queen Mother heard enough. She did not interrupt immediately. Instead, she remained nearby as Charles tried to explain that certain traditions could not be changed simply because circumstances had become uncomfortable. Camilla pushed back, insisting that if the family expected her loyalty, it could not permanently treat her as temporary. Charles left the room frustrated. The older royal stayed behind. Silence settled for several seconds before she turned toward her lady-in-waiting and spoke with remarkable calm. Affection, she said, could never be allowed to rewrite the crown. The remark was later preserved in a documented private account attached to the archival material, giving the moment far greater weight when the decree was eventually uncovered. The Queen Mother then slid the ceremony list across the table. A permanent instruction must be prepared. Within days, she summoned a trusted legal secretary and dictated the first version of the restriction. The document was designed to survive personalities, reigns, and changing public moods. More importantly, it contained a contingency clause, a provision explaining what should happen if someone later tried to overturn the instruction. That clause now mattered more than ever. It specifically anticipated a reigning monarch attempting to weaken the restriction for the sake of a spouse. Charles understood the implication the moment the old wording resurfaced. The Queen Mother had not merely reacted to one argument. She had built the decree around the possibility that loyalty and duty would someday collide exactly as they were colliding now, and Camilla was about to force him to choose which one came first. That buried decision now stood between Charles and Camilla, and the next conversation would force them to say aloud what neither had wanted to admit. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with Camilla closing a door. No private secretary remained, no lawyer could interrupt, and no ceremonial language could soften what had happened. She turned toward Charles, carrying years of sacrifice, scandal, endurance, and eventual acceptance, and demanded to know whether he intended to defend the position she believed the monarchy itself had finally recognized. His answer would strike at something deeper than protocol. Camilla stood across from him with the old decree still dominating every thought. To her, this was no longer about missing a handful of formal appearances. Crown events were occasions where senior royals visibly represented the sovereign and the continuity of the monarchy, so being removed from them publicly redrew the limits of her place beside the king. Years of acceptance suddenly felt conditional. Charles knew the danger was larger than one ceremony. The legal advisors had already warned him that challenging the restriction could trigger a serious family and institutional dispute, because several ceremonial responsibilities had been arranged around its surviving instructions. He could not simply tear up the document and pretend it had never existed. Camilla heard that explanation and stiffened. She reminded him what she had endured to reach this point: public anger, years of judgment, endless questions about whether she belonged. She had stayed beside him through all of it, believing that time and duty had finally settled the argument. And now this can take it back? Charles did not answer quickly enough. The queen consort rose from her chair and walked toward the closed door. She stopped there for a moment, then turned back. "Are you speaking as my husband now, or as the king?" The monarch slowly set his pen down. He told her the truth. As her husband, he wanted to protect her from humiliation. As sovereign, he could not ignore a restriction simply because it wounded someone he loved. The distinction landed badly. Camilla stared at him, as though the two roles had just become enemies in the same body. Charles then revealed what the lawyers had confirmed during their documented private briefing. There was no simple mechanism allowing him to destroy, conceal, or quietly disregard the decree without formally confronting its remaining provisions. Then came the detail that changed her anger. William had already been briefed. The future king had been drawn into the matter because the document assigned the heir a direct responsibility for preserving certain ceremonial boundaries. That meant Charles was no longer the only person standing between Camilla and the restriction. Her expression hardened. For the first time, she understood that even if her husband wanted to bend the rules, his son might be expected to stop him. The conflict had shifted. What began as a painful argument between husband and wife was becoming a test between two generations of royal authority. And William was about to discover that inheriting authority over the decree was far easier than carrying the emotional cost of enforcing it. William did not celebrate when the lawyers explained what the decree gave him. He looked troubled. The document placed the future king inside a conflict that belonged partly to another generation, yet its language made avoidance almost impossible. The Queen Mother had created more than a restriction. She had established a chain of responsibility, and now the man expected to preserve the monarchy's future was being asked to enforce a boundary that could humiliate his father's wife. William listened as Palace Council explained why his name appeared so prominently in the surviving instructions. The direct heir meant the person next in line to inherit the crown, and under this decree, that position carried a narrow duty whenever protected ceremonial rules came under challenge. It did not place him above Charles. It made him responsible for preserving certain continuity boundaries that were meant to survive one reign and pass safely into the next. The prince felt the weight immediately. Later, in a private conversation with Sophie, he admitted that he had no desire to see Camilla diminished in public. She had already endured enough scrutiny. But if he bent the document because the consequences were painful, he feared he would create exactly the precedent the Queen Mother had tried to prevent. Sophie understood his concern, but she did not let him hide behind principle. She reminded him that Charles would remember more than the final decision. The king would remember who stood across from him when it was enforced. William could preserve the rule and still lose something personal with his father. That warning stayed with him. The lawyers then uncovered another layer. The decree did not merely describe who should be excluded. It named substitute representatives for several specific events, meaning Camilla's absence had been anticipated in extraordinary detail. Sophie's name appeared on the list. She read it twice. The trusted confidant had entered the dispute as someone offering advice. Now the document placed her directly inside it. If the restriction was implemented, she would be expected to assume duties Camilla had believed belonged to her. William looked toward the acknowledgement page. He signed. The pen remained against the paper for a moment longer than necessary. Then he asked the lawyer whether there was any path that could preserve both the decree and Camilla's dignity. The answer was painfully limited. The palace could manage language, timing, and public presentation. It could not erase the practical effect. That was the moment authority became consequence. William had not chosen the conflict, but he had now accepted responsibility for carrying it forward. Sophie had not sought Camilla's place, but she had been named to step into part of it. And the next decision could no longer remain inside a legal file. Within hours, the debate stopped being theoretical, because the first empty place on the royal calendar suddenly had Camilla's name beside it. The first consequence arrived not through a speech, but through a revised schedule. One line had disappeared. Camilla was no longer listed beside Charles for an approaching crown remembrance ceremony, and Sophie had been placed into the ceremonial role identified by the decree. For the palace, it was administration. For Camilla, it was the first physical proof that the document had moved beyond archival paper and entered her daily life. Camilla received the revised internal program without anyone beside her. The schedule was the working document palace staff used to assign who would attend, stand, speak, and represent the crown at formal events. Her eyes moved quickly down the page until they stopped at the ceremony she had expected to attend beside the king. Her name was gone. She read the line again. The queen consort folded the paper once and placed it beside her untouched tea. What made the change so painful was not simply absence. These ceremonies had become part of the public proof that she belonged beside Charles, and now the decree was beginning to remove that proof, one event at a time. Sophie felt the weight from the opposite side. She had not asked for the role. The trusted confidant had been designated by the old instruction as an alternate representative, meaning the document itself had named who should step in when Camilla was excluded. She went directly to William. The prince heard the anxiety in her voice before she finished the question. Would people see obedience as ambition? Would accepting the duty make it appear that she had benefited from another woman's humiliation? William answered carefully. Refusing the assignment would not restore Camilla. It would only create another crisis around a rule they had already agreed to enforce. Then Charles received worse news. A palace aide brought forward the next group of affected dates, and the king immediately understood that the restriction would not end with one ceremony. Several upcoming events carried the same designation. One stood out. An important anniversary service was specifically named in the decree as an occasion from which Camilla must remain absent. This was no general rule being interpreted loosely. The old document had anticipated the event directly. Charles set the schedule down without speaking. The monarch now faced the truth he had tried to contain since the decree surfaced. Every new date would reopen the same wound. Camilla remained seated long after the room had emptied. Then she made a decision. Before palace officials announced the revised arrangements publicly, she asked for one private conversation. Not with Charles, not with William, with Sophie. The request reached her quietly, but the meaning was unmistakable. One woman had lost the place. The other was being told to take it. And when Sophie entered that private meeting, neither woman had lawyers, titles, or protocol to hide behind. The conversation everyone feared would become bitter took an entirely different turn. Camilla and Sophie met privately, without courtiers, secretaries, or legal advisors. One woman had just lost a visible part of her royal standing. The other had been ordered to occupy it. Between them sat the possibility of resentment. Yet what emerged from that room would change how both women understood the conflict, and would finally shift the story away from humiliation toward acceptance. Sophie entered expecting resistance. The reassigned ceremonial duties placed her in a position that could easily look like advancement, even though the decree had chosen the substitute role for her. In simple terms, those duties were formal responsibilities, carried out on behalf of the crown, and taking them over meant standing in places Camilla had expected to occupy herself. Camilla did not begin with accusation. She made it clear almost immediately that her anger was aimed at the decree, not at Sophie. The queen consort knew the trusted confidant had not created the document, had not requested the assignment, and had not pushed anyone aside to receive it. That distinction changed the room. Sophie admitted she had been afraid Camilla would see her as part of the punishment. She confessed that every time she looked at the revised schedule, she felt guilty. Palace appearances could turn duty into rivalry with frightening speed, and she knew the public might interpret her presence as proof that one woman had risen because another had fallen. Camilla finally said what had been hurting her most. Missing ceremonies was painful, but the deeper wound was feeling that an old judgment had reached across generations and fixed her identity forever. She had spent years trying to prove that loyalty, service, and endurance could change how she was seen. Now one sealed instruction seemed to tell her that some verdicts could never be escaped. Sophie listened without interrupting. Then Camilla revealed, during that private recorded conversation preserved in the palace account, that she had made a decision. She would not force Charles into a public attempt to destroy the decree. The king had already been pushed between marriage and monarchy, and she now understood that making him fight openly could damage him more than it restored her. The trusted confidant answered with a promise. Whenever she performed a duty transferred under the document, she would never treat it as a personal triumph. She would not present herself as Camilla's replacement, and she would not allow palace gossip to turn reluctant obedience into victory. Sophie reached toward the ceremony folder. Camilla placed her hand lightly over it first. "Do the duty. Just don't let them turn us into enemies." For the first time since the decree surfaced, the conflict softened. But only inside that room. The palace was now preparing to announce the decision publicly. And outside the gates, sympathy, anger, and fascination were about to collide. The private conflict had softened. But outside the palace gates, the decree was about to become a national spectacle. By morning, what had been whispered through palace corridors was splashed across Britain in enormous type. The story no longer belonged only to Charles, Camilla, William, or Sophie. Broadcasters debated royal authority. Historians revisited the Queen Mother's influence, and crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, trying to understand how a sealed instruction from another era could still shape the monarchy. Yet one public image captured the mood more powerfully than every argument combined. The palace moved first with a carefully worded confirmation. Officials acknowledged that historic ceremonial instructions had altered Camilla's participation in a defined category of crown events, meaning formal occasions tied directly to royal continuity and representation. The statement avoided personal blame, but that restraint only sharpened the debate. Some saw the decision as proof that monarchy survives by respecting inherited boundaries. Others saw it as a harsh judgment, carried forward long after the people who created it were gone. Charles watched the coverage in silence. The king saw his wife's private disappointment reduced to headlines, panels, and arguments between strangers. Every discussion seemed to turn one painful family decision into a public contest over loyalty, authority, and legitimacy. Camilla sat nearby, listening without reacting, until one aide quietly suggested she should issue a statement distancing herself from the Queen Mother's decision. She refused. The Queen Consort would not attack someone who could no longer answer for herself. More importantly, she understood that a public fight might make the story larger, not smaller. Her silence could be misunderstood, but anger would confirm every fear that the decree had created a permanent war inside the family. Then the coverage shifted. A major broadcaster displayed the ceremonial timeline and confirmed that Sophie would perform the first reassigned duty, while William accompanied Charles. The trusted confidant's name immediately became part of the public argument, while the future king was framed as the man responsible for preserving the old restriction. Outside Buckingham Palace, the mood became even more striking. A crowd gathered beneath a newspaper front page, carrying the enormous headline, "The Queen Mother's Final Word." Some people defended the decree. Others called it cruel. Then one woman stepped toward the railings and quietly laid down a small bunch of white flowers. The moment spread across broadcasts within minutes. It captured the strange mix of respect and discomfort better than any commentator could. People were not simply choosing sides. They were watching an old royal judgment collide with a living marriage. Charles finally switched off the television after seeing Camilla's photograph beneath the headline. She looked toward him. "Don't defend me publicly." The monarch understood immediately. Any personal intervention now could turn restraint into confrontation. The headlines had done their worst. The final judgment would come elsewhere. That decision prepared the way for one final act. An appearance that would reveal whether the decree had broken the family or forced it into a painful new balance. When the ceremony finally arrived, there was no dramatic reversal. No last-minute rescue. No document was torn apart. And no royal order erased what the Queen Mother had written. Camilla did not take the place she once expected to occupy. Sophie carried the assigned duty. William stood beside his father, and Charles faced the consequence of a decision he had not created. Yet the most important moment came afterward, away from the formalities. Sophie carried out the transferred responsibility with deliberate restraint. The ceremony itself represented one of those formal crown occasions where senior royals visibly stand for continuity, service, and the authority of the monarchy. She understood that every gesture would be watched for signs of triumph, so the trusted confidant gave none. She performed the duty exactly as required, and nothing more. Charles felt the absence beside him. The king had obeyed the inherited restriction, but obedience came with a personal cost. Camilla had once expected to share moments like this with him, as proof that their long and difficult journey had finally reached acceptance. Now that place had been removed, not by scandal in the present, but by a judgment carried forward from another generation. William understood that pain as well. Later, the future king met privately with both of them, and explained that enforcing the decree had never been intended as punishment. His responsibility was narrower and colder than that. He had inherited a duty to protect a ceremonial boundary, and ignoring it simply because the consequence was painful would have made that responsibility meaningless. Camilla listened without fighting him. She had already made her choice. The queen consort told Charles that exclusion from certain ceremonies would not define the entirety of her marriage, or service, or her personal worth. She had spent too many years allowing public judgment to determine how she saw herself. This decree would wound her, but she would not allow it to destroy her. Sophie carried a similar resolve. She accepted that any future duties transferred to her would have to be performed without celebration, rivalry, or the suggestion that another woman's loss had become her victory. Later that evening, Charles sat beside Camilla without staff present. He reached for her hand. She did not argue about the document. She did not demand another appeal. "It is done." This time, the monarch answered immediately. Yes, that was the final truth. The decree had left Camilla wounded but standing, Charles saddened but steadier, William more conscious of the burden waiting in his future, and Sophie determined to serve without triumph. The monarchy had preserved its inherited boundary, but everyone involved had paid something for it. There was nowhere left for the conflict to go. The Queen Mother's decree had been obeyed, Camilla's ceremonial boundaries had been redrawn, and the monarchy moved forward, carrying both the cost of that decision and the finality of it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.